Hello, everyone. Welcome back. During these times that we're dealing with coronavirus and COVID-19 and all that, I've been intrigued by some of the comments I've heard from various people in our community. Several days ago, I had a brief conversation with a nurse. And one of the things she said to me, and this really wasn't about medical aspects of what we're doing, it was more theological. She said to me, this thing, this virus, this pandemic, didn't surprise God at all. And another comment I heard from somebody else, this one was a gentleman that I know who's not in the church. Neither of these people are. This guy was talking about the things that we're supposed to be doing, like wearing face mask or face covering or something like that. And his comment was, when it's my time to go, it's my time to go. And if a virus is going to get me, that's fine, whatever. I'm just not going to worry about it. So both of those comments, whatever you may think of them, both of those comments have to do with a very important theological notion. And that's the idea of God's providence. Providence is a word that actually comes to us from Latin. And it comes from two Latin words that mean to see before. So providence has to do with knowing something ahead of time at its root. But from a theological point of view, providence is really all about God's continuing relationship with the universe, or God's ongoing relationship with God's own creation. And there are a number of different ways to look at that. One is to think about God's relationship with the universe as dealing with sustenance and governance. Sustenance has to do with maintaining and preserving the created order. Governance has to do with controlling and guiding creation according to God's purpose. St. Augustine even wrote, without God's sustenance, the universe would collapse into nothingness. Without God's governance, the universe would plunge into chaos. So that's how Augustine thought about providence. Another way to think about it is using the word synergism and concurrence. They refer to God and humanity working together to bring about God's will for the created order. And there's also this notion of general providence and special providence. Or those of you who are into economics can think of it as macro and micro. So general providence is causing the seasons to change. We're in springtime right now. The grass is growing and flowers are in bloom and the leaves are starting to appear on the trees. So causing the seasons to change, causing the sun to rise and set every day, or rather the earth to rotate on its axis. So even provisions of things like food and clothing and shelter. This is general providence. Or the other kind is special providence. And these are very, very specific things that God does for us. So if someone were to say, God answered my prayers and made this happen, or if they were about to have some sort of mishap, people sometimes say to me things like, well, God was really looking out for me that time. That would be an incident of special providence. And there's a couple of scripture verses that are often utilized whenever we talk about the subject of providence. One is from the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, chapter 50, verse 20. And this is in reference to Joseph and his time in Egypt. You may recall his brothers were fed up with him because he was kind of an arrogant little spoiled brat, and he was kind of full of himself, and so they just wanted to get rid of him. So they sold him off into slavery, and later it turned out that he rose to power in Egypt, second only unto Pharaoh, and he was actually able to save his own family from a worldwide famine. And so in chapter 50, verse 20, we hear Joseph saying, even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. So some people read that verse and they think, okay, well, God wanted Joseph's brothers to sell him into slavery. And God wanted all of these things to happen to Joseph, including his time in prison, so that he could eventually rise to the level of second in command under Pharaoh and save his own family. Another verse that people often use from the New Testament, and this one's much more familiar, is Romans chapter 8, verse 28. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. So, and we're going to talk about that verse in a lot more detail a bit later, maybe not in this video perhaps, but in the one following. So, questions that we might ask ourselves regarding God's providence and God's relationship with God's universe is, one, is it possible for us to thwart God's will? Is it possible for us to sort of throw a monkey wrench into God's plan? So if God's will is for something to happen, do you and I have it in our power to make it not happen? Or what about random chance and events? Sometimes a person can be doing absolutely nothing wrong. They could be doing what they're supposed to do, and they have some sort of a bizarre accident. It's very unusual, but it does happen. I've read stories of people driving down Interstate 77 near Fancy Gap, and a boulder will roll off the side of the mountain, hit a car, and kill the person in the car. They weren't doing anything wrong by driving down the road, and so it's kind of a random thing. Or I know of other instances where a tree limb or a tree itself might have fallen on its own because it was rotten, and sooner or later it was going to fall. It just happened that somebody was standing under it when it fell. Are these random events somehow caused by God? Or what about hurricanes? What about tornadoes? What about terrorist activities? I've heard some high-profile Christian ministers say that a terrorist attack is really God's judgment upon these people. Or when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and Louisiana, there were people saying in the Christian realm that this was God's judgment upon this sinful city. Apparently, never mind that it wiped out plenty of churches in the process. Or what about COVID-19? I've heard people say that this is part of God's judgment on the world. So how do we answer those questions? Well, and in terms of our lives, we certainly all have moments when we seem to be in control of things and we are able to choose. Like Darlene and I really wanted Chinese food for lunch today, and we were able to have Chinese. It was what we wanted, it was what we could do, and we did it. We have the freedoms to make decisions and reap the consequences of those decisions, be they good or bad. Other times, our lives seem to be manipulated by forces that are way out of our control, like the pandemic that we're in now with the coronavirus. This is a virus that no one, I don't think, expected to come forth, and it has gone all over the world, and now we're having to live in a way to protect ourselves and our larger community from from what this virus might do to us, but that's not something that we had control over. So we're being told to distance ourselves socially. We're not able to gather here in our sanctuary for corporate worship like we're used to doing. So sometimes there are things that we control, sometimes there are things we don't control. And so where does God's providence, where does God's will fit into all of these things? Well, I think we need to first understand that God's will is not like some sort of blueprint that it's fixed and written in stone and set for all time. God's will is really more about God's active relationship with us and within us. God's will can even get a little messy sometimes because life gets messy. We don't all live plan A lives. Sometimes we have to go to plan B or plan C or plan R. And I think God can work with us wherever we may be in those situations, but it's not, as I understand it, God's will isn't this thing that was set in stone before time itself and it's just being carried out. I think it's a dynamic thing. Getting back to Romans 8:28, this is perhaps the most quoted verse in all of Scripture regarding providence and the will of God. But the ancient manuscripts that we have of Romans vary just a little bit. And this leads to two basic points of view about this verse, two basic ways to translate it. And the two primary points of view are expressed in the King James Version and the Revised Standard Version. The King James says, all things work together for good to them that love God. The Revised Standard says, in everything, God works for good with those who love him. And there is a big, big, big difference between these two translations. And any other English translation that you may read of Romans 8:28 takes the point of view of either the Revised Standard point of view or the King James point of view. So we're going to have to wait until next week to take a look at how these two translations differ and what the subject of the sentence is in each one and how that has a radical difference in how we interpret those words in Romans 8:28. So between now and then, I hope that you will stay safe and stay well and pray daily for those who are affected by this pandemic and be faithful in your walk. Thank you very much.